Hello, in this video we're going to have a look at how to integrate our new equipping item system as well as the stat system that we've introduced in the previous video. So our custom server now supports equipping the items, and when you do so it's going to be modifying some of our stats. So we're going to be looking at basically having the UI for that inside Unreal Engine. So that's what this post is about, and this post will go through step by step how I managed to do this in Unreal Engine, so do check that out. So yeah, let's get started with a quick demo. So in the demo, what we're going to be able to do is log into our character. So we'll just choose any one of these two. And we're going to have the inventory as we did before, but now what we're going to be able to do is equip items. So as you can see, when I do so, my health actually increases, my max health increases. My current HP stays the same, so that's why you'll see it going down. And what I've also done is I've created this little widget for our stats. So these buttons are currently placeholders, but as I mentioned before, I'm going to have a couple of base stats, so strength, stamina, dexterity, intelligence, and I'm going to have some derived stats as well. So I've just created this so that we can see things a little bit more clearly, but basically when I equip or unequip the item, you'll be able to see that these stats actually change, as well as the action bar as well. So that's basically what we're going to be achieving in this episode. So essentially equipping items and modifying our stat system. And yeah, let's have a look at the Unreal Engine implementation for that. Okay, so perhaps we'll begin with equipping items. So what we're going to have is our inventory, and inside the inventory, we're going to have the inventory contents, and each item will be represented by an inventory slot. So the functionality that we're going to implement is that when we double click our slot, so the slot containing the item, we're going to send a request to equip the item. So that's why the functionality will be inside the inventory slot. So when we're going to double click it, so there wasn't a double click override functionality, so I've achieved that using this functionality here. So when you click it once, we toggle a Boolean to enabled, and after 0.3 second, it will automatically disable it. So that means if you click it again within that 0.3 seconds, it's going to go to true, and it's going to implement or it's going to call this function here. So the actual functionality is going to be inside the component, which is connected to the character. So this inventory component, which we've created in the past. And this inventory component sits inside the character blueprint. So we're going to be calling this function to equip item using socket. And all we need to do is basically ask the server to go ahead and equip that. So when we call this function, we're going to send a message to the server, and the server's then going to give us some responses that will process, whenever we get those responses back. But the actual payload of this request is relatively simple. All we need is the player name and the item instance ID. So the item instance ID is that which identifies the item inside our inventory. So each item will have a unique identifier for its existence. So that's what we're going to use here. And when we send the message, we basically just specify that the update type is equip item. So as you can see, it's quite simple. We say equip item, provide the player name, and give the item instance ID. So the send socket message is using our socket integration component, which is basically just handling all the communications with our server. And all we do is convert that structure to JSON, and we send that message using the WebSocket client. So that's how we equip the item. So you can see we don't actually try and move that item as part of this request, because we need the server to validate that request to make sure they can actually equip that item, and then we'll just process the response. So the response will be, okay, this was a valid request. You can go ahead and equip the item, and it will tell you what the character is currently equipping. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. Okay, so the responses will come into the process message received. So I often refer to this function as being the post office. Right, it receives the response from the server, and it sort of needs to identify where does this message need to go, and it does that via the message type. So in this case, we've added a couple of new message types, so add equip item remove equip item, and stats update. So the one that we're going to look at first is add equip item. So we've requested the server to equip an item. Once it's processed that, it's going to give us a response. One of the responses is actually an inventory update. So it's going to remove that item from the inventory, and it will add that equip item into our equip item slot. Okay, so let's have a look at that. So handle equip item, so that's another function here. So you can see that the player socket integration doesn't actually equip the item, but it asks the inventory component to go ahead and equip it. So it provides you the socket response, and inside the socket response we have the inventory data. So part of the inventory data, we're gonna provide it some of the equipped items that we want to set equipped, and that's how we're going to handle that. So before we go ahead and look into this function, let's have a look at what that model looks like. So the equipped item model. The key thing that we care about here is the category. So the equipped item, you know, where does it fall onto? Like which slot does it go to? Is it a weapon? Is it a helmet? Is it a shield, armor, etc.? So that's what we're going to use the category for. So this is provided from the server. It basically tells you that this is a weapon. So it goes into the weapon slot. And the next one is the item instance. So part of the item instance, we have the item ID. And based on the item ID, we evaluate what mesh to draw and, you know, some other interesting information. But the key one is going to be the mesh. Part of the stats, we'll also see that the item instance contains the item information. So things like the item effects. But that's actually handled separately by the stats system. So let's continue on where we were then. So we were asking the inventory component to process this item. We get an array of equipped items, and we ask the equipped items widget to go ahead and set these equipped items. So let's have a look at the equip item widget. So it's this one over here. So this is the upper part of our inventory component, or the inventory widget. And all of these slots that you see around, those are the equip items slots. So basically, those are the ones that will be populated with the item that we're going to be equipping. So that's why this functionality here, set equipped items, lives inside this component. So we receive the items that we want to add, and we go through each one. And we basically care, like I say, about the item instance and the category. So we evaluate the equip slot by category. And as you can see here, I've just used a standard switch statement. So if the category is a belt, you know, return the belt slot. If it's a cape, return the cape slot, etc. So let's see. So that's how we evaluate which equip slot the item goes into. Then I save the item instance here, or rather, sorry. So I set the item instance to that slot, and then I draw the icon for the item instance. So this is where I say that I evaluate which mesh to draw based on the item instance. So inside here, we should find that we're going to be using the item ID. So you can see from the item instance, we grab the item ID, and we know which item to draw based on that item ID. So if we look into this map, it basically says, okay, if your ID is 15,000, draw this sword mesh, right? And that's the one that we're drawing right now. My item ID in that character's inventory is 15,000. So that's how it knows which mesh to use. Okay, so we can go back now, and we can go back again. And that's essentially how we equip the item. So you can see here, this is not really the end of the story. So for example, we'll want to go ahead and add that item to the player's hand, right? So, but we'll handle that separately. For the meantime, we just want to populate our character's inventory widget and handle some other processes. But you can see how this data flows through our components and through the blueprints. So you can also see that we've just set the item instance inside the equipped item widget. So basically, each one of those widgets inside, I'll show you now. You can see here we've got the inventory equip slot. So we've essentially set the item instance inside there. So this is quite important because now if we want to unequip that item, we have the item instance in order to do so. So basically in this component, if we go ahead and double click this item, so if I go into event graph, it should be unclicked. So you can see here, when I double click it, I'm going to be doing the opposite essentially, right? So I'm going to be grabbing the inventory component and I'm going to ask it to unequip the item, and which item instance is the one that I've just set earlier. So I go ahead and do a very similar function. I ask the inventory component to unequip the item, and the request for that is very similar. So instead of equip item update type, it's now unequip item. And I provided the item instance ID as well as the player name. So, and then again, I send that request over using the player socket integration component and wait for the response from the server. The response from the server once again will come into the process message received, and now the update type will be remove equip item. So again, this is not going to be the only response, right? Like, so when we equip and unequip item, we can actually get 3 responses, could even be 4 in the near future. But at the moment it's 3, so we're going to be updating our inventory. We're going to be potentially removing a different equip item. We're going to be adding an equip item, and we're also going to be getting stats update for anything that's changed. Okay, so let's have a look at the unequip item. So that's this function here. So again, from the player socket integration, it just uses the reference to the inventory component in order to ask that component to process this response. And instead of using the item instance structures, I'm just going to be providing the item instance IDs. Is just a lower footprint, right? So I provide an array of item instance IDs that I need to unequip. And I ask again the equipped items widget to clear those equipped items. So again, this is going back to this widget over here. We just ask it to unequip these item instance IDs. So previously, when we equipped them, we added the references of the equipped items to these to this variable equipped items. So this is a map, and the map contains a string, which is the item instance ID, to the equipped items structure. Part of the equipped item structure, if I go back to equipped item, one thing that I've added is a slot widget. So this is going to be a reference to the widget containing that item. And this is just to make it easier for me to clear it. That's pretty much the only reason. These 3 items are the payload from my server. The slot widget is only for Unreal Engine to sort of deal with this request. So let's go back to here. So you can see that clear equipped items, I grab myself the array of item instance IDs, and for each one, I search my equipped items to find that structure. And you can see I have my slot widget, and I simply ask it to clear the icon because that item is no longer equipped. So that's how we deal with unequip item. And obviously, again, this wouldn't be the end of the story. So you might be doing some other things, for instance, removing that mesh from your character. As you may have noticed, my character itself doesn't get modified yet. So we'll look at that in a bit. But at the moment, this is how we process that request. So perhaps a reminder as well. So we can use Postman in order to sort of demonstrate what kind of requests and responses we're getting. So I've covered this in the previous video, but perhaps it'll be good to see it as well. So I've prepared a character and I'm going to ask it to equip an item. So I'm going to basically say equip this item over here, which is part of their inventory. And you can see that when I send this request using the WebSocket, I'm actually going to get a couple of responses back. So one of them is add equip item. So it basically asks me to go ahead and add this item, and the category here is a weapon, right? So it'll also have these item effects. And the other responses is inventory update. So you can see here that this item is basically removed from the slot. So I'm not going to go ahead and display it in my inventory. There's, again, multiple ways of achieving this. And the last update is going to be a stats update. So when I equip this item, I modified my stats. So it goes ahead and sends me these updates. For initialization purposes, there's other requests that we can make as well. So for example, fetch stats. This will just provide me a full list of stats for my character. So this will be used for constructor. And likewise for inventory, so fetch inventory. This will provide me a full inventory, and for fetch equipped as well. So because you can see that whenever I make these requests, they're sort of giving me an update rather than a state. So whenever you start up your character, we're going to want to basically get a full state from where it begins, and then we're going to be modifying it as we go along. So for example, when you equip an item, it will only give you the update for that item rather than a full state. So that's part of the design here as well. And to show you how we initialize it as well, so part of the inventory component, we have here prepare inventory, and here's where basically we get our information about the character from the game instance, and this is mainly the player's name. And we're basically gonna go ahead and create the inventory widget, and then we ask to fetch the inventory and fetch the equipped items from the server. So these are the requests I've just shown in Postman. So you can see here, for instance, fetch equipped from server. We just need to provide our player name and provide the update type of fetch equipped. And likewise for the fetch inventory from server, very similar, fetch inventory, and you provide just the player name. And again, the responses will just simply come into the socket integration. So it will go into the process message received, and it just goes into that flow. It will provide you a full state, but it processes the items individually, and it just adds them into our inventory. So that's how we go ahead and initialize the component. So initialize your inventory from the beginning. And so the last thing that we'll look at is the stats update then. So before we dive into the handle stats update, perhaps I'll just quickly introduce the stats component that we've created. So in a very similar way to the inventory, we've created a new component to handle stats related things, and we're going to be assigning it to our player. So basically the player character is now going to have this stats component as well as the inventory one, right? So we'll also initialize it in a similar fashion. So when we've set up the WebSocket, we'll go ahead and ask to fetch the stats. We'll also assign it to the game mode. Perhaps I'll actually just show it right here quickly. So when we initialize the socket connection, we add components to the game instance. So this included the inventory component, the player socket integration, and now the stats component as well. So after we added it to the game instance, we prepared the inventory. So this is where you saw us fetching the inventory, fetching the equipped items. We also ask the stats component to go ahead and initialize itself as well. So what we're going to do here, so we're not using the isPlayer at the moment, but we will do soon because we're going to assign the same component to mobs as well. So mobs will have stats like health, mana, etc. as well. But at the moment, we're not utilizing that, so we're only building it for the players at this point. So when we initialize it, what we're going to do is link the things inside. So basically we get the actor ID, so when we're fetching stats we know whose stats to fetch. isPlayer will be used to correctly display the widgets. So for example, if it's your player, we're going to be displaying your action bar and things like that. If it's a mob or something like that, we'll have the overhead bar, etc. And we also provide the socket integration, which is used for communication. So we've done it using this method so that we ensure the socket integration is configured at the point that we've entered this function. And now we can link our other widgets. So for example, link the action bar and link the stats widget. All that's doing is just fetching the widget from, basically find the widget of the class, and if found, we assign it to a variable. So the stats component is going to be modifying the health bar from the action widget, so that's why we need to link it. And it's also going to be controlling that stats widget that you saw earlier, the one where we can see our base stats and the derived stats. Speaking of those, this is them essentially, right? So you can see the base stats over here, which is basically a map where the string is the key and integer for base stats. So your strength and dexterity, intelligence, all of that is going to be an integer. And the derived stats is very similar. It's a string, which is the key for the stat, and the value is a float because it basically goes through some calculations, so it's not guaranteed to be an integer. So that's our stats component. So let's have a look at how we process the data. So one of the first things that we did was fetch the stats from the server. So you can see that in order to do so, we just needed to provide the player's name and fetch stats. So this payload shouldn't really refer to player name. It should actually be actor ID. I'll change that later. But all we need to do is basically make a request to fetch stats. Once we do that, again, we do this via the socket integration. So it's being sent like any other message. And again, we're going to be receiving the response over here. So handle stats update. So this is just a generic function for us processing any received stats, and it will handle a merge. So technically, this is not always going to provide us a state. It can give us an incremental update, but it basically handles either. So from the socket message, we've created a new structure representing stats, and perhaps that's the next thing that I'll show you. So this stats structure effectively reflects the one from our custom server. So if I go into our server, I've introduced this in a previous video, but basically the key things that we're interested in is this base stats and the derived stats. So this structure essentially reflects the structure from the custom server, and you can see that we have base stats, which is a string to integer map, and derived stat, again, string to float map. Okay, so when we're receiving them, those are the key things that we want to receive and process. So let's go ahead and go back to the player socket integration. So handle stats updates, it gives us the stats structure from the message response. It uses the stats component to process the stats update. Okay, so that's this function over here. We make sure that when we receive this message, that these stats belong to the actor, which is processing them. And then we basically merge the stats with what this component already has. So like I say, this could be incremental updates. So we don't want to just replace the variable that we have. We just want to merge them. And the way to do that is simply iterate over the stats that you have and add them individually, right? So you don't just replace that variable, you go ahead and merge them one by one. Okay, so let's go back here. So once we've processed that, so once we've merged the base stats, we want to merge the derived stats as well. So this does pretty much the exact same thing, but for the derived stats. And then we want to update the dependencies. So in our case, it's just two widgets. So the first one is the action bar, and the other one is the stats widget. So for the action bar, we want to update the derived stats. So the only thing that we're controlling here is the HP. So this is the action bar that I have right now. This is actually a demo from an asset pack. So I've referenced that in the post. So if you're curious where it's from, check that out in the post. It's not mine, but I think it's really cool. So it's really nice. And the only thing that we're updating here is the HP bar. So here you can see that I've updated the derived stats inside the action bar widget, and I'll be just updating the HP. The way that that works is simply grabbing the max HP and the current HP and setting the HP glass to the progress value, essentially, right, which is current HP divided by the max HP. Okay, so that's all it's doing right now. And obviously, later on, when we're going to have other status effects, you know, for example, you're stunned or you're burning or whatever, we're going to add additional icons over here, right? So it's going to be displaying the status effects for that character. Okay, so that's this one over here. And let's see what other items we have. So stats component. So after we've updated the derived stats inside the action bar, we're also gonna update the stats inside our stats widget. And that one will display both the base stats as well as the derived stats. So that's why I'm providing both of those here. So this component is this little window over here, and it's dynamically creating the entries for the stats, right? So they're not sort of static. I'm going to be creating them based on the payload from the server. So the first thing that I'll do is basically copy the base stats and the derived stats that I've obtained from the stats component into this widget. So you can see them over here. And then I'm going to go ahead and populate the base stats first. So what I do inside here is I iterate over the base stats and I basically check, have I already added this widget or not? So like I say, it's adding them dynamically. So those widgets aren't created straight away. And the reason I've done that is to sort of make it a bit easier in the future to basically add new entries. So the way I do that, so for instance, if I haven't added them before, so basically part of the initialization of this widget, I'm going to go ahead and fetch all of the stats, and then for each one, I'm going to process them. So obviously it will be the first time it sees that data. So it's going to go ahead and create the base stat entry. So it's going to go ahead and create one of these widgets. So this widget basically is used to represent the base stats. And the key difference between base stats is that I'm going to have this button to add the stats. So it'll be invisible while you have no attribute points, but then when you have some attribute points when you level up, this button will become visible. And I've also bound the values for the stat name and stat value. So you can see I've bound the value to stat value here and the text to stat text over here. So that when I go ahead and create this widget, you can see that I'm populating the text to display over here and the value to display over here as well. So the text to display is going to be translated. So I'm actually providing a, well, this is a label essentially, right? So this is coming from the server. So this is how the server stores these labels. So for example, attack speed comes capital with the underscore over here. And I'm translating it to sort of a human readable form. This will also be useful later on if you have internationalization or something like that, or perhaps you'll use something else, right? But basically you can deal with translations here if needed. So that's how I've done that over here. So you can see basically I provided the stat key. So this is coming from the server. I get the human readable text and I provided the stat text. From the base stats, I grab the value of that stat and I provide it over here. And then I add it to the scroll box. So the scroll box is inside the designer. You can see that this is the scroll box. So I'm adding that component as a child inside this scroll box. And then I populate the base stat widgets. So the next time I get an update, it's gonna go to true. So basically, does the base stat widget contain the entry for this stat key? So later on it will be true. So I'm not going to be recreating that widget. I'm just going to be updating the value inside that widget. So that's what's happening over here. So after I've populated the base stats, I'm going to basically, well, I'm going to add a separator. So there's basically a small separator between my base stats and the derived stats. Perhaps you'll see it later again in the demo. And I just make sure I create it once by using this Boolean of has separator. So if it's false, it will go ahead and create it. And if it's true, it's not going to do anything. And then I populate the derived stats. So every time I'm going to get an update, it will basically rerun these functions. So this one is basically the same, but my derived stats is of a different type. So it's float instead of integers. I'm just going to iterate through the derived stats widgets. And I'm basically doing the exact same thing. So you can see stat labeled text. It's executing that to get the stat name. I'm grabbing the value to put into value here. I'm adding it into the scroll box. So perhaps I could refactor this into some interface essentially and just reuse that functionality. But at the moment, it sort of proves the purpose. So yeah, this will do for this time being. And that's basically it, right? So this component was really just used to display the stats to make it a bit easier to read, but it wasn't actually the focus point of this episode. Okay, cool. So perhaps we can have a look at the demo, and I'll just go step by step with what it's doing. Okay, so basically when we start the game up, we'll go into a character. I think this one has an item. So we start the game. When you initialize the character, it goes ahead and fetches the player's stats. It fetches the inventory, it fetches the equipped items. So that's why from the very beginning, all of these are populated. You can see it has the data. Now, when I, for instance, double click this item, it sends a request to unequip item. This yields in 3 responses. One of them is to update my inventory. One of them is to remove the equipped item. And the other one is to update my stats. And yeah, so every time I do an action, it will basically provide me an update for all of the responses which are associated to that action. And the other thing as well as double clicking that item, I'm able to right click and click equip item. So that's actually using the same blueprints just from a different place, and it will do the exact same thing essentially, right? So all of these blueprints are available in the blog post, so if you're interested, do check that out. But yeah, so this is the progress that I have so far. Perhaps soon, maybe in the next video, I'll show how we can do these drag and drops. So basically movable windows, as I thought that was quite interesting. And then after that, perhaps we can start looking into perhaps combat. I'm not sure, maybe I'll need to make some modifications to the stat system to support that. But yeah, best of luck with your projects and see you next time. See ya.